What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Phoenix channel. Today is February 2nd, 2020. Shout out to everybody checking out this video. If you like this content, consider hitting the like button, consider subscribing to this channel. And so without further ado, I just came back from DC actually. Just came back from DC, had an amazing time meeting up with Cody from Imagine Tech, Lisa, Adam. I saw actually the one and only legendary Zach Gall. Shout out to you if you're tuning into this video. Also saw Adriana from Cypherglass, Rob from EOS Detroit, Dan the Man was obviously out there, and a number of other people. Maybe not even the EOS space. I just interacted with and just started just talking to them and giving them my perspective on where things are going, and they offered theirs, and it was, it's always interesting showing up to events because you never know what to expect. You never know what's going to happen, and it's just always an amazing time. And just traveling in general, you just get different insights and even different thoughts in your mind, right, that you wouldn't get just staying grounded in one location. Obviously back in Phoenix, definitely taking in the sun, getting my vitamin D in after workout. Hope you guys are doing the same as always. I'm all about that. So without further ado, let's get into things. So at DC, Dan the Man definitely came up with a plan. He went up on stage with actually no notes and without a slide deck, and that's probably one of the more hardest things to do, is to give a speech for 30 minutes without visual aids and without really any notes, and just giving it. And he delivered. He did a great job, I think, keeping things balanced between the technical and high level, and obviously focused on enterprise level deployment of blockchains, but also touching upon why governments or why businesses or why individuals would want to run a blockchain, which is something that I don't think we've heard before across other, I would say, blockchain projects, right? I think the narrative is starting to change, guys, and that's why I wanted to make this video. And let me give some perspective for that. For many years, if you go back to the Bitcoin days and even with the Ethereum days, there was more of this narrative that the main chains like Ethereum or like a Bitcoin would run all the apps, and there would be second layer solutions, and that's how things would work. And if you listen to what Dan is saying in this latest talk in DC, and you can find the video online, he's very clear that his vision for blockchains, the future vision, involves each individual, each company, each government potentially running their own chains, and the chains themselves interacting with one another through something like IBC. So there's a common code. I guess you can also say that's a standard in some ways from an engineering perspective. I would imagine it would be a code and a standard that is agreed upon by specific body, and then through IBC those chains talk to one another. And so that's very different than I think what most, even within the EOS space, are envisioning. That may come as a surprise to a lot of people, but Dan was very clear about it in this last talk, and it sounds like that's where things are going, where it doesn't necessarily matter so much where you're running and submitting your transactions per se. I mean, there is a trade-offs, and there is still a need to probably have one chain validate another chain, and so maybe that's where the value comes in. But I thought, out of everything I heard from that talk, if I had to just point to one thing and say if there was one thing I took away from that talk that I continue to think about, and something for you to think about probably, it is that notion that we'll have millions of chains all interacting with one another. So that's very different, I think. That's very different than what I believe most envision. But we're seeing the groundwork being laid in by companies like Block.one to help make that a reality. So we just have to continue to track the development of such things like that. So the first half of his talk mostly involved touching upon the flawed infrastructure of today's database server-client relationship technologies and the costs that are not necessarily realized by most businesses and governments to continue to use those systems and continue to have broken and very flawed and vulnerable systems, right? And that this solution is already there. It's blockchain, and they don't have to reinvent password management. They don't have to reinvent cryptography. This is all provided by blockchain technologies. And one of the interesting strategies Dan used in this talk was to keep the discussion mostly agnostic. So he didn't really touch upon EOS IO until the latter quarter of his talk, which I think was actually a really good strategy. Just shows that this really applies to everything, not necessarily just EOS IO. This is really an agnostic conversation to help educate people in government why they should care about this stuff, just from an industry perspective, which I thought, again, was a superb move. So the other aspect to it, obviously, is the trust and accountability you get with something like blockchain. You could get, because you can have blockchains being controlled by several different nodes for, say, a government, and then you can offer the ability for people to monitor that, right, in some way. And you don't necessarily have that in today's world. You don't have that level of granularity to know where money's flowing, to know the solvency of a bank, for example. And it's really interesting to me that, you know, we're at this stage right now. It feels very ripe for that transformational change to occur in terms of radical transparency for public entities. You think about the bank and its role that it has in society. You think about government and its role it has in society. So it's only a matter of time, guys. But again, that's something to keep in mind here, something to be aware of. And then the other thing in his vision that he mentioned, so the individual blockchains and companies each running their own blockchains and governments each running their blockchains, was pretty interesting to hear. The other aspect of it was this passwordless feature with hardware keys. So he sees that being part of this future and helping to secure users when they sign for things, and tools that tell them what they're signing for. So if you go back and watch that video, seemingly this is tied in with voice. And so a lot of people just think voice is this ID, but the impression I got from hearing Dan's talk is that maybe there's additional tools that come with the ID system, or there'll be tools built with it that enable users to know what they're signing for, some kind of a common language. We've seen examples of this with Scatter. Scatter's done an amazing job with some examples of that in terms of explaining what you're doing. And we'll probably see Block.one roll out something very similar. One of the questions I still do have, even after this talk, was how a company like Block.one maintains decentralization in providing voice ID verifications for users. Let me better explain that, and hopefully we can get a response from Block.one. Shout out to Ash Oro and Mark Woods if you're checking out this video, and shout out to Dan the Man as well. But one of the questions is you know, if something like this voice ID becomes so successful and people start using it and on-ramping themselves on a social media site for voice, and this ID is then used for other types of systems, Uber, Airbnb, it could be used for health records as well, which is something that actually Dan hinted at in this latest talk. I guess the concern would be, is this creating potentially a too big to fail, in a sense that it gives a company like Block.one so much power over individuals? And are you recreating the Facebook issue that we have today, the too big to fail issues that we have today with banks? Are you reinventing that within the blockchain domain? And so I'm really interested to hear what the strategy is to maintain competition, but, you know, leverage Dan's patents, right? So there's kind of a weird, and I don't know how they're going to do that. And I'd like to know from you guys if you have the same concerns. And this is more a critic type question, but I think that's the role of a community. The role of communities is to not just cheerlead. You come to this channel because you want to hear raw, for the most part, unscripted content, and you want to get insights on things that are going on in the space, whether it's in DC or other places, and that's why I go. I show up because you don't know what you're gonna get without showing up, right? And you don't know what the regulators are gonna think or the government's gonna think. So showing up, guys, is a key part of it, and I hope more of you guys consider doing that, whether at your local governments or at DC, because I can tell you from watching and participating in that talk, the event, the whole event, which was several hours from 8 to, I think we left around 4, because it was a lot of information, a lot of people, and Dan's talk was amazing. It was mostly agnostic, like I said, but a lot of these people, like I mentioned maybe earlier, is a lot of them were trying to sell their solutions as vendors directly. The whole talk was about that. We had some groups talking about creating currencies, digital currencies, and essentially reinventing the same problem we have today, which is a lack of also checks and balances and accountability. And I don't want to go on a rant here, but since this is my channel, you guys get some of that, a dose, as you guys know. One of the things that I came away with outside of Dan's talk with some of the other people that were discussing their proposals for new currencies, even countries, representatives from different countries who have already done this, is they still fail to understand what is money, and the fact that they are still the rule makers for these systems makes their implementations of digital currencies using blockchain very flawed, because if you have the same people or a very, very small group of people controlling all the rules for a system and there's no checks and balances, you aren't really solving the problem. You're actually probably making it worse, or you're keeping it pretty much the same. And so it just goes to show, guys, on a time frame, people really lack a lot of education in terms of monetary theory and monetary policy. And these are people with PhDs and master's level educations that are directors and high level ups in these countries. And it's just, to me, it's kind of sad that they're coming here to DC and educating our regulators that these are things they're doing, and that this is the most amazing thing, while not acknowledging the flaws of how they've implemented these technologies. And so it's up to people like you and me to have a voice and show up and provide the narrative, provide the basis of why these half-ass flawed implementations are flawed. Okay, so just keep that in mind, guys. I don't want to make it a rant or get tinfoil hat with you guys, but I have to give you a little dose of that each time in my videos, so I hope you enjoy that. So Dan went on to talk about something like voice, speaking of voice, and the fact that it will provide verification of all users, and real names will be used, and probably a layer of security, obviously a layer of security for those accounts. But he goes on to say, and I want to ask you guys something, if you study Dan's evolution within the blockchain space itself, he started with BitShares and then went on to Steemit and then went to EOS.io. And for those that don't know, BitShares was an exchange, Steemit was a social media site, and he took those experiences in general, made a general purpose solution with EOS.io, which could be used for not only social media, but it can be used for a lot of different things. And his logic and what he explained in his talk yesterday was, if it can be used for social media, if it's good enough for social media, it can be used for a lot of other things. And so he kind of tied that in with voice, which I thought was interesting. And so it kind of harkens back to Voice ID being used not only for voice, but for other different applications that you might want to build, or I might want to build, and potentially used on different chains as well. So you think of the likes of a reimagined Uber or Airbnb, which I know we've talked a lot about on this channel, and I know you guys are probably blue in the face hearing it, but I think we're pretty much there. And with something like a Voice ID, you talk about programmable regulatory stacks potentially on something like a Voice ID. That has the ability to transform the entire financial space as we know it. But it goes further than that. I mean, Voice ID and the beta will use AML, KYC type users. But, Dan has also hinted on proof of humans and and his patent and the recognition of a digital identity, which may not necessarily involve AML KYC. And so one of the interesting things I've been thinking about or considering is there someone within the community who would be interested in creating, or maybe even Block.one, or maybe this is part of their voice technology. I don't really know. I don't have any insider information. None of this is investment advice. You guys already know that. This is just commentary. But I'm wondering if gamification of AML KYC and adding more users within your node as a verified user is part of the strategy for how you create a network, say made up of 1 million users to start with, or 100,000 users, and scale that out to the whole world. Because once you have those 100,000s of users, you don't necessarily need AML KYC of all other users. There's ways to validate and secure the rest of the world once you have those trusted nodes doing the jobs on the ground, right, to verify each of those users. So if we took the business model, or the model of Bitcoin mining, right, mining rewards, and we took the same concept and applied it to humans and the ability and value of adding a human to a network. You go back to the likes of something like Metcalfe's law and the value also of a network, right? And as you add more users, the network's value also increases. You look at the likes of something like Facebook and why it's so valuable. Could you actually see this additional seed, if you will, of AML KYC users be part of this larger strategy to recreate this network of verified users, which they themselves are not necessarily all AML KYC'd? I think that would be a really interesting application, whether Block.one does it or not. I think maybe a different group could do it. Be really interested to hear your thoughts on that. So if you have an opinion about that, let me know. If you need more information about it, or you want me to elaborate, put it in the comments, because I think that's a really amazing idea if it's something that he doesn't do. Dan did go on to answer one of my questions. There was a number of questions answered. I tried to bring him back to the subject of why we were there, which was part of it was government's role in future of money, and it being in DC and a lot of government officials being there. You know, what could be done by the government to encourage the adoption and research and incentivize people to build the technology, because we're in a global competition with other countries. And so we've seen China and other countries create initiatives to educate people, and we haven't seen the same urgency here in the United States. So I was kind of hoping Dan would talk more about that. Dan did talk partially of what I was hoping he would say, which is government using the technology to improve the accountability and trustworthiness of government actions, right, and banks. And so that was a big part of it. But still I'm hoping to see more of that educational arm from Block.one, and you know, what can we do outside of Virginia Tech, which is amazing that Block.one has that, but there's a whole host of people outside of Virginia that stand ready to help other people educate. We're at all different educational levels. Not exactly dumb people, but you know, there needs to be some kind of official initiatives. I mean, we subsidize a bunch of other systems within our country, but we can't necessarily find a strategy to subsidize education for blockchain, yet it's one of the most important and fundamental technologies of the world, arguably. You know, I find that kind of hard to believe. So with that said, guys, I'm going to let this, I'm going to end it here. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe, leave a comment, and until next time, this is Phoenix signing off. Peace.